Dear friends, tonight is a very special night, particularly for myself. As you're aware, the topic of tonight is religious bias against Bábís and Bahá'ís by Iranian historians. I have often thought about this subject, but never understood it as well as I should. And I could not really answer questions about it as much. And when I talked to Dr. Masumian and he proposed this particular topic, although I had asked him for another topic, I couldn't say no to this. So thank you so very much, Dr. Masumian, to have accepted this. And actually, this is the first time that the topic of the Baha'i community of Iran is being addressed in this fireside. We are ever so grateful again. And we are really thanking Dr. Masumian for being here. Dr. Masumian, if my voice goes away, you let me know. Okay.
Will do.
Thank you. Of course, we're looking forward to having further discussions about the same subjects in future firesides and forums. Tonight, Dr. Masumian will be presenting an overview of some of the positive changes and reforms that the appearance of the Bab and Baha'u'llah and their teachings brought to Iran, offering examples of historical distortions against the Bábís and Bahá'ís, and instances of how media outlets in Iran attempt to dehumanize them, meaning the Bahá'ís, the Iranian Bahá'ís, as a community. And a short, brief bio of Masumian. He obtained a PhD in instructional systems design and technology. I have to go to school for 5 years to understand what that means, but it's okay. Humility is good. From the University of Texas, most of his professional life was spent at Advanced Micro Devices, AMD, where he developed the first computer-based training courses for AMD in the mid-90s and managed multiple global e-learning platforms for employee development. His research interests are in the areas of Babi Baha'i studies. He has co-authored books with his wife, Farnaz Jan, and son, Adib Jan, as well as several Babi Baha'i studies articles independently and with his sons. He has also published in the field of learning technologies. Dr. Masumian, with this brief introduction, please go ahead. I hope your voice would be better than mine.
Well, the audience, you and the audience can let me know if I also break up or my voice goes down or up. Please let me know. Let me go ahead and begin sharing my screen and my PowerPoint deck. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. So first of all, let me thank Forouz Jan for inviting me here, and also for all of you who are here tonight or this morning, depending on where you are. As you all know, there is really a science to studying, interpreting, and writing good history. We now even have a technical term for that as a discipline. It's called historiography. Sound historiography takes skills, a lot of skills, not just in reading and interpreting history, but writing about events, people, places in an objective, unbiased, and logical manner. Otherwise, regardless of how much time and effort you invest in it, the end result is either intentional or unintentional distortion of history. And that would be a disservice to everybody. But if, as a historian, you apply the required principles and methodologies to your approach, then you will end up with a reliable history that can sometimes even turn into timeless classics. For example, this classic from Edward Gibbon that I'm sure most, if not all of you are familiar with, is the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbons stuck to those principles and methodologies that I just named, and as a result, he created a masterpiece. Unfortunately, in modern Iran, so far, we have seen very little of that when it comes to the appearance of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the reaction to it. They have not been objective. What potential benefits their teachings have had for the country? Very little on that. Although I'm happy to say that that trend is slowly beginning to change. Now, Gibbons was an example of a great classic, following the sound principles and methodologies of historiography. At the opposite extreme, you have this kind of work, frankly. This is a court-ordered history. In other words, it was subsidized or paid for by the court. In this case, the court of Muhammad Shah, the Qajar king, the father of Nasiruddin Shah. He essentially ordered a history that this man, Muhammad Taghi Sepeh, known as Lisanul Mulk, wrote over the course of several years in 9 volumes total. But there is one volume that covers the establishment of the Qajar dynasty all the way through the first 10 years of Nasiruddin Shah's reign. And that obviously covered the first 14 years of Bábí history as well. Now, you can get a quick glimpse of how objective this history is by paying attention to the title of the book. It's called, in the original Arabic, Nasikh al-Tawarikh, or as we Persians call it, Nasikh al-Tawarikh. Excuse me. It means the abrogator of all histories. Now think about that title. Right there and then, you can tell that there's a red flag. The author is obviously not very humble, and not surprisingly, because it was a court-ordered history, any mention of the Bab and Bábís are usually very negative. They are all portrayed as heretics and troublemakers. If he was an objective writer, what you are seeing here highlighted, unfortunately, you can't read it in the original Persian. That entire paragraph is essentially a praise of the king, the person who ordered the history. Now think about it. This really takes exaggerated language to a level that I personally have not seen before. You know, usually, typically, you use a few accolades, a few adjectives, but not an entire paragraph. Obviously, that alone tells me that the priority for this particular historian is not to stick to the truth, but to write a history that will be pleasing to the king. Now, if Seper, the historian, was objective, he would have written a completely different history. But then that history would not have been pleasing to the king. So again, when Seper gets to the advent of the Bab and his movement, you read mostly insults and baseless accusations against the Bab and Bábís. On the other hand, an objective historian would have seen the Bab for who he really was, a surprisingly young 25-year-old man with revolutionary ideas for his time, heading a reform movement that could have potentially brought drastic changes to the religious and social structure of the entire country. Within a matter of a few years, the Bab's claims and his message literally shook an entire country. The Bab knew his audience well. So the vast majority of Iranians, as you remember, were and still are Muslim Shias. Therefore, the Bab had been expecting, the Shias had been expecting the return of their promised Messiah, Mahdi, or the 12th Imam, for over 1,000 years. So the Bab knew he had to be slow and methodic in how he unfolded his mission for this audience. In other words, he revealed his intentions in stages so he wouldn't shock the Shias. At first, he claimed to be just the gate to the hidden Imam the Shias were waiting for. Once there was enough momentum in his movement, then the Bab claimed to be the hidden Imam himself. When the audience was ready for the next stage, he got closer to his real claim, namely that he was a new divine messenger with his own book and his own dispensation, meaning that the Islamic dispensation had ended. In the fourth and final stage, the Bab claimed the station of divinity. But it is very important to note here that by divinity, he didn't mean that God had taken on flesh and become a human being, something that still a lot of Christians believe in about Christ. What the Bab meant was because God, in his essence, was infinite and unknowable, and he couldn't be comprehended by the puny minds of his creatures. So for us humans, a messenger of God like the Bab was as much God as we ever hoped to know. In simpler terms, the Bab was saying that in terms of attributes and virtues, he was reflecting the perfections of God, just as we see the reflection of the sun in a mirror. The sun hasn't descended into the mirror just reflects an image of the sun for us to see. Also, he revealed his main book, the Bayan, in Persian, which was very refreshing to his Persian-speaking audience because they were used to Quran, which was in Arabic, although he did later reveal a smaller version of this same book in Arabic. The Bab also encouraged the use of printing press, which had arrived in Persia about 1820, so about 24 years earlier. Of course, the technology wasn't very prevalent there yet. So most early copies of this book, which is like Aqdas for the followers of the Bab, the Persian Bayan, was transcription copies that were handwritten by professional transcribers. The Bab also anticipated another messenger would follow him soon, and that would, of course, be Baha'u'llah. He had a lot of progressive ideas. For example, for the first time ever, we have a prominent religious figure from Shia background that extols the virtues of a European lifestyle, their scientific achievements, including their postal service and their printing press. That was unheard of. As you know, the Bab came from a family of merchants, the Afghans. So when dealing with India, which was a British colony at that time, news of European lifestyle and their scientific advancement would have reached the Bab, and he supported those Western achievements instead of resisting them. And that appealed to the more enlightened sectors of the Iranian population. In addition to the Shias, those who were secular in their thinking were also attracted to the Bab's revolutionary teachings and the fact that they saw a young man in his mid-20s who not only had the courage to challenge the clerical establishment, but the audacity to announce the end of Muslim Sharia. And of course, the fact that one of his most prominent disciples was also a woman, that immediately attracted the masses of Persian women to the message of the Bab. And of course, we know that the Persian women during the Qajar period were very subjugated. This is a picture from that era. And of course, we know what happened next. Execution of the Bab in 1850 and massive persecution and killing of Bábís all over the country. Even the most barbaric acts against the Bábís were shown as justified punishments for criminals who deserved agonizing deaths. And those events are sometimes described in graphic language. For example, in the summer of 1852, in what was essentially a bloodbath in Tehran, we had about 35 Bábís brought to the Tehran's bazaar and then distributed among people of different guilds, ranks, and positions. And they all took pleasure in killing their Bábí victims in the most barbaric fashions. You had military officers, soldiers, bakers, butchers, even officials of Darul Funun, which was the prized school of learning in Tehran at the time. They all participated in the massacre of the Bábís. It was basically a horror show. How do we know the details? Well, we know because the newspaper of the time, one of the first ever printed in Iran, known as Bahá'ís of Oakville, or News of Recent Events, covered these executions. I must tell you, as someone who has read the account of that day in Persian, the language used against the Bábís in this account is shockingly crude and inhuman. The Bábís are portrayed as pretty much subhumans who deserved the most cruel deaths. They are individually named in this account, and the perpetrators of their massacre are also mentioned with pride, unfortunately. Now, Baha'u'llah was one of the early followers of the Bab, as you know, and he was eventually banished from Iran to the Ottoman territories. There, he claimed to be the promised one that the Bab had foretold. And the vast majority of the Bábís, of course, accepted his claim, and they became known as the Bahá'í. Baha'u'llah continued what the Báb had begun, and he introduced other groundbreaking reforms. For example, he banned the concept of holy war or jihad. He abolished apostasy or irtidad. In other words, you can leave his religion. You can leave any religion, convert to any religion, or become an atheist or agnostic. He banned dissimulation or taqiyya. As you know, Shias especially practiced dissimulation. He also abrogated the category of unclean or najis, as Shias believed people of other faiths, especially Zoroastrians, the ancient religion of Persia, they were najis or unclean. Same thing with Buddhists and Hindus, by the way. He also encouraged interfaith dialogue and association. You all remember that well-known passage from Baha'u'llah, which says, consort with the followers of all religions in a spirit of friendliness and fellowship. Eventually, during his exiles in Adrianople and Akka, Baha'u'llah began to offer sweeping reforms with global consequences. On several occasions, he even called himself the world reformer, or in the original Arabic, Musleh Alam. Why? Because he saw himself as a messenger who had come to establish a new order in the entire world, not just in Persia or in the Ottoman territories. His idea of what should be the primary goal of all politicians at any level, be it local, national, or international, is extraordinary for its time. Let me explain. Today, decisions by politicians and political systems are based entirely on national interests. The United Nations, we go back, the United Nations was and still is a nice idea. But we see every day that in its current form, unfortunately, the UN is unable to execute many of the goals in its charter, including the most important one, bringing peace to the world. You may remember when the UN was created after World War II, its main mission was to maintain international peace and security in the world. Has it been successful? Hardly. Why? Because one of the main reasons is that representatives of every country is there to secure only the interests of his or her own people, and maybe sometimes the interests of their allies too. But no representative there is given the mandate to go to the UN and stand up for the rights of all the people on the planet, regardless of nation, race, creed, and so on. Now compare that with what Baha'u'llah said to the representatives of the British Parliament, and by extension to the representatives of all nations everywhere in 1866. That's 155 years ago. Adib Jan, would you mind reading these quotes?
Happy to. O ye the elected representatives of the people in every land, take ye counsel together, and let your concern be only for that which profiteth mankind, and bettereth the condition thereof. It behooveth them, however, to be trustworthy among his servants, and to regard themselves as the representatives of all that dwell on earth. This is what counseleth them in this tablet, he who is the ruler, the all-wise.
Thank you. So Baha'u'llah here is essentially saying that representatives of all parliaments everywhere should be concerned with welfare of all humanity. So when adopting policies or enacting laws, they should be considering the consequences of their decisions on everybody on the planet. Now, I'm not going to spend much time on these bullets because I assume most of you are familiar with these teachings. Baha'is believe if all these teachings are taken to heart and acted upon, we will all be living in a very different world. Wouldn't you say? Now, the Persian Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911 stands as a pivotal moment in Iran's modern history. Why? Because it propelled the country toward modernization and westernization. Numerous historians have so far written detailed accounts of this particular period. Most of them give credit to this man, Malcolm Khan, and his publication of a newspaper called Qanun, or Law, in London, in which he supported the idea of establishing a parliament in Iran in 1892 as the primary engine for the constitutional movement in Iran. You may remember 1892 is also the year Baha'u'llah passed away. What these historians have not considered so far is that in 1873, almost 20 years before the publication of Malcolm Khan's newspaper began in London, and more than 35 years before the start of the Persian Constitutional Revolution, Baha'u'llah had anticipated that revolution and also the establishment of a parliament in Tehran. In his Kitab-i Aqdas, or the Most Holy Book, Baha'u'llah symbolically addresses the city of Tehran and says, "Let nothing grieve thee, O land of Ta, or Tehran, for God has chosen thee to be the source of the joy of all mankind. Ere long will the state of affairs within thee be changed, and the reins of power fall into the hands of the people. Verily, thy Lord is the all-knowing. His authority embraces all things." The orange highlighted in that paragraph is what you see at the bottom in the original Arabic, where Baha'u'llah is prophesying that there will be a change of power structure in Iran very soon, and there will be a parliament. And that's exactly what happened a few decades later. In addition to that, a couple of years later, Baha'u'llah instructed his son, Abdul Baha, to write a treatise on the principles that could lead to the reconstruction of Iran and contribute to the welfare and prosperity of its people. The outcome was this book called The Secret of Divine Civilization that we all are familiar with. This was written in 1875, when Abdul Baha was only 31 years old. Baha'is consider this book as a roadmap to social, religious, and political reform in Iran. Again, years before Malcolm Khan began to publish his Qanun newspaper in London. This book was addressed to both those in power as well as the general population of Iran. So it also covered the proper relationship between the rulers, meaning the Qajar officials, and the citizens of Iran. In all likelihood, copies of The Secret of Divine Civilization made their way to the homes of people of influence in Persia, probably including Mushir ad-Dawleh. This man was the Persian General Council in Istanbul and was instrumental in bringing about the various stages of Baha'u'llah's exile from Baghdad to Istanbul, then to Adrianople, and eventually to Akka. And he used all the influence he could muster to restrict the activities of Baha'is. But in 1870, something happened. When Sheikh Salman, Baha'u'llah's courier, was on his way to Persia with Baha'u'llah's tablets, people, officers of this man, Mushir-ud-Dawla, arrested Sheikh Salman, and in Aleppo, by the way. And so he started studying some of the writings of Baha'u'llah and noticed there is not only nothing harmful in them, but they're all great ideas. So he began to change his attitude towards Baha'u'llah and Baha'is. And from then on, he is reported to have been very sympathetic to the Baha'is, and in some cases even helped and defended them. Another factor in his change of heart toward the Baha'is was probably because one of his close relatives had become a Baha'i. So it's quite possible that that relative passed on a copy of The Secret of Divine Civilization to Mushir-ud-Dawla. However, when Abdul Baha first published this book, he intentionally did not put his name on it as the author, because he knew that if readers found out that the son of Baha'u'llah wrote the book, most wouldn't touch the book, let alone open and read it. Now, here are some of the highlights of this book. Again, remember, it was written in 1875, exactly 30 years before the Persian constitutional revolution even began. Abdul Baha talks about the need for a freely elected parliament, the need for separation of legislative, judicial, and executive branches, which is one of the cornerstones of democracy in any country. He also said that we need to observe the rights of others, as the rulers and those governed need to respect each other's rights. He also supported universal education, of course. And finally, he said we need to uproot corruption, not just among politicians, but also among the masses of people. This is still a big problem in Iran today as we speak, unfortunately. The principle of consultation and the need for a body that included representatives of people was already a cornerstone of Baha'i approach when Baha'is formed their very first assembly in Tehran in 1899. That's 6 years before the Persian constitutional revolution even began. Some of the other political reforms that Baha'u'llah proposed were parliamentary governance, of course, universal peace, collective security, proposed principle of collective security, federation of nations, a world body, world tribunal, international police force. These were all some of the other reforms that Baha'u'llah proposed. So in addition to Malcolm Khan, there were other figures that these histories of Persian constitutional revolution name, and you see the most prominent 6 here. On the top left, you see, hang on just a second, let me get my highlighter. I think that will make things a little easier. So here we've got Jamaluddin Afghani, or Jamaluddin Assadi, as he was a pan-Islamist. He wanted to unite Muslims all over the world. But he was also a close associate of Malcolm Khan. And they both had great ideas too for reform, but they were not the only ones. On this side, Agha Khan Kermani is the only person on this screen that actually met Baha'u'llah in Akka. So he was familiar with Baha'u'llah's teachings. And we mentioned Mushir-ud-Dawla already. These two clerics, Behbahani and Tabatabai, were at first
بس یاد گرفتن به بچه دیونم کردن.
Let me ask again, if you're not speaking, please mute your mics so others would not hear you. So these two clerics at first were pro-constitutional revolution because they thought that eventually there would be a constitution based on the laws of Islam or Sharia. When they realized that constitutionalists were after European ideas and they wanted to write a constitution based on the French constitution, they suddenly changed their minds and became opposers of the constitutional revolution. The most public opponent of the constitutional revolution was this man, Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri. Interestingly enough, even he knew the impact of the Bábí and Bahá'í teachings. He considered constitutionalism actually a plan by the Bábís, the Bahá'ís, and what he called naturalists or tabi'iyun. He meant atheists, basically, and agnostics. Well, as a result, when the constitutional revolution was won, one of the first things that the revolutionaries did was they hung Sheikh Fazlullah. And that's a picture of that day. In this history of the Persian constitutional revolution, the author, Nazimul Islam Kirmani, who himself was a cleric, reports that on one occasion, Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri goes to the Tubkhane Square. You see the picture here. This is, remember, the Qajar period. And this is one of the first squares in Tehran or in Persia period that was established by Nasiruddin Shah. So he goes on a pulpit with a copy of Baha'u'llah's Kitab Aqdas in his hand and points to the same Arabic verse that I showed earlier, where Baha'u'llah predicts that there will soon be a change in the political system of Persia and the reins of power will fall into the hands of the people. And Nuri says, there you have it, folks. Baha'is are pro-constitutionalism and are trying to make that happen so they can claim that Baha'u'llah is a miracle worker. So even Nuri knew of the role that Baha'u'llah and the Baha'is were playing in the forward momentum for the constitutional revolution. But most historians of the period failed to recognize that. Another history of the same revolution was written by a familiar face, E.G. Brown. His was published in 1910 toward the tail end of the revolution. In his book, Brown gives most of the credit for the movement's conceptual and theoretical framework to Jamaluddin and Malcolm Khan. And he also names the same two clerics as key figures for generating popular support for constitutionalism among the masses of Shias. Now, Professor Amanat, Abbas Amanat, believes Brown did this intentionally because he was sympathetic to the Bábís, especially Azali Bábís, who were more vocal in supporting the constitutional position. And he felt that if he emphasized their roles too much, he would be endangering the Bábís. And his theory makes sense to me personally. Now, education of the masses has always been a key cornerstone to establishing democracy in any country. Since Abdul Baha knew the importance of education and he knew that Persians badly needed schools. In the early 1900s, he had several American Baha'i women travel to Iran and take up residence there to establish and operate schools. You see the first three of them here: Dr. Susan Moody, Dr. Sarah Clark, both of whom were homeopaths, and Lillian Kappas, who was a teacher. They are surrounding this young Persian woman by the name of Ismat Tehrani, or she was known as Tayere, not to be confused with Tahireh Qurratul Ain, who lived a generation before Tayere. Here, they are actually, the three American ladies are with Tayere while Tayere is sick, and she died prematurely at the age of 39. This is one of probably the last picture, the very last picture of Tayere shortly before she passed away in 1911. Now, Tayere was herself, very much like Qurratul Ain, a vocal supporter of women's rights. And you see, for that time, for a woman to cut her hair short and also appear in pictures without a veil or even a scarf was unheard of. But thanks to the influence of Dr. Moody, Dr. Clark, and Lillian, she threw away basically the hijab and started appearing even among men without any cover on her head. What you see here is a picture of her next to one of 6 different articles that she wrote in support of women's rights and education of girls in a paper of the constitutional period called Iran No, or the New Iran. In addition, all her articles are also, not for a second, compare her views to the views of Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, the same clerics who considered establishing schools for girls the same as opening houses of prostitution. They lived, it feels like they lived in different worlds. Tayere also voiced opposition to polygamy and also considered lack of equal educational opportunity as the only reason why Iranian women appeared to be less intelligent than Persian men. And she was absolutely right. Now, perhaps the first academician who started acknowledging the importance of the Bábís and Bahá'ís in the constitutional revolution was this woman, Professor Mangol Bayat, who is the professor of Islamic civilization and culture, has served at MIT, Harvard, and University of Iowa. In 1991, she published a new book on the Iranian constitutional revolution called Iran's First Revolution. In there, on pages 186 to 187, actually, she emphasized that Nuri's leaflets accused the Bábís and naturalists of being the main villains in the origination and promulgation of the Constitution. And so Nuri was claiming that the Bábís and Bahá'ís and naturalists were trying to legalize alcoholic beverages, again, establish schools for girls, which was the same to him as houses of prostitution, And they were also trying to take away the budget for religious ceremonies and pilgrimages and put that money into construction of factories and railroads. God forbid, right? She also was the first to reveal that Azalis were practicing dissimulation or taqiyya to advance their plans during the Persian Constitutional Revolution. Another professor, Janet Afari, who is a professor of religious studies and feminist studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, published a book on the Persian Constitutional Revolution back in 1996. In there, she was the first who specifically pointed out the role of two Baha'is, Sheikh Reis, the person on the right here, who was a Qajar prince and a Baha'i, as well as Tayere, whom we just discussed. Now, Sheikh Reis's home was an important center of discussions around why Persia needed to adopt a constitution and establish a parliament in Iran. He was so widely respected by the constitutionalists, excuse me, that they picked him as the speaker of the parliament for a short time when it was first established. So within a few years after Abdul Baha's emphasis on the importance of education and providing schools for children, you have numerous Baha'i sponsored schools established throughout Persia. At their peak, I think we had 54 or 55 such schools, even in some of them in very small towns. Here you see a picture of the very first one, which is called Tarbiyat School, which means education school. It's for the boys, and it was established in 1899, 6 years before the start of the Persian Constitutional Revolution. This is their English class, a picture of their English class, taken in 1902. Here you see some of the students as well as some of the teachers in 1912. Here you see Miss Kappas, Lillian Kappas, as the teacher of school for the boys here with some of the children, and notice that they are holding, some of them are holding pictures of Abdul Baha. This one is a picture of a school called Tawakkul for boys in Qazvin, not too far from Tehran. This one was founded in 1906. This is actually Tawakkul Girls' School. This is the very first school for girls that was established in 1909, 3 years before Tehran had a school for girls, for the Baha'is. And by the way, these schools were not just for Baha'i children. Anybody with any background was welcome. In fact, in many of them, the majority were non-Baha'is. So this shows that these schools were committed to educating the masses of children in Iran, not just the Baha'is. This is a picture of boys' schools in Hamadan. Their library had over 4,000 scientific books in Persian, Arabic, English, and French. And when they had budget deficits, they would fund them through plays, through singing, music, sports performances, and lectures for which tickets were sold. Many of these ideas were brand new to Persia, and most of them came from Miss Kappas, Lillian Kappas. This is another school in Najafabad, not too far from the city of Isfahan, and it's called Sa'adat Milli, which means national prosperity. The names of these schools often were picked by Abdul Baha, and they all emphasized teachings of Baha'u'llah. This one is a picture, again, from the Najafabad school from 1934, when they had between 400 to 460 girls. This is an intermediate Siyy'íd school graduation ceremony. You see the teacher at the center. Actually, the ones on the front are all teachers, and the students with their diplomas in the back. This one is from a ceremony, a commencement ceremony, where students are being granted certificates of excellence. And you notice that there are frogs in the background. Now, these schools were not known outside of the Baha'i circles until 2009, when, there was very little known about them outside the Baha'i circles, until this book was published by Dr. Soli Shahwar, called The Forgotten Schools. First, it was published in English, then a larger volume was published in Persian by the same title, The Forgotten Schools. Dr. Shahwar is a professor of Iranian studies at the University of Haifa in Israel. He is not a Baha'i. Now, something important also happened during the Constitutional Revolution. Iran's finances was a mess. The country badly needed help. So when the Persian government asked for help in restructuring its finances, Iran already had an embassy in Washington, D.C. So the government reached out to its Persian charge d'affaires in Washington, D.C. Well, that young man happened to be a Baha'i, Ali Qoli Khan. You see a picture of him here. You see a picture of him with his American wife, Florence Breed, in 1913 in front of the White House. Florence came from a socialite family in Boston. Their marriage was the first marriage between a Persian Baha'i and an American Baha'i. It was probably one of the first Persian-American marriages, period. So to help Persia with its finances, Ali Qoli Khan suggested a young, skilled New York banker by the name of Morgan Schuster. This was the first instance of American influence in Persian politics, and it began as a very positive experience. Schuster was an idealist. He genuinely wanted to help Iran and the Iranians. He had read E.G. Brown's book that I just mentioned on the Persian Constitutional Revolution, and he was very committed to it. So he wanted to do sweeping reforms in Persia's finances. Persians fell in love with Schuster. But when he proposed the idea that all establishments must be taxed, that obviously didn't sit well with the colonialist powers, the Russians and British, who were competing for influence in Persia. Schuster also intentionally shunned the Russian and British embassies when he first came to Persia and refused to pay a courtesy call on either ambassador. This obviously further angered the Russians and the British. So they concocted a plan, and eventually the Russians forced Schuster out. Schuster was obviously very angry, and upon his return to the US, he was so fond of Iran and so angry at the Russians especially, that he wrote a book that contained stinging attacks not only on those two powers, but also on Muslim clerics. He said basically that as long as Iran remained under the influence of the Russians, the British, and Muslim clerics, it will not have a bright future. His book was appropriately called The Strangling of Persia. Now, a dangerous form of religious bias against the Bábís and Bahá'ís has been conspiracy theories, because they often have serious consequences. For the Bahá'ís of Iran, that has been the case. These conspiracy theories have usually tried to establish ties of the Bábís and Bahá'ís to foreign powers, especially Russia and Great Britain. First, let's look at this first one, which is a book that was written in the 1930s and 40s. There were multiple versions of this published. They all had the same title, and it's completely fabricated. And it was distributed in Iran under the title of Dolgorki or Dolgorkov's Memoirs. This was supposedly Persian translation of Confessions of Prince Dmitry Ivanovich Dolgorkov, known to Persians as Dolgorki, who was the Russian ambassador to Persia from January 1846 through May of 1854. This supposed memoir claimed that both the Bab and Baha'u'llah were Russian agents. Of course, that was a total fabrication. You see, beside the fact that the original Russian version of the supposed memoir has never been found, no rationale was ever given by the authors as to why this Russian prince would make these confessions, incriminate himself, and also jeopardize the Russian influence in Persia. Additionally, this memoir has so many inaccuracies that the authors had to keep correcting and reprinting new versions of the book. For example, the memoir contained detailed dialogues between the Bab and this Russian prince in the early 1840s, in which Dolgorkov encourages the Bab to begin claiming that he was a new prophet. Unfortunately, the authors didn't know enough history to realize that Dolgorkov never actually knew or met the person of the Bab. And he did not even arrive in Persia until 1846. He wasn't even aware of the Bab's movement until about 1847. Of course, Baha'is were not, even during the time of the Shah, were not allowed to defend themselves. In another fabrication, this Russian prince is supposed to have given money to Baha'u'llah to help him build a house in Akka. The problem was that the Russian prince had died in 1867. That's a year before anyone knew that Baha'u'llah was about to be exiled to Akka a year later. Then there is another conspiracy theory, which said that the Bábís and Bahá'ís were agents of the British. This one was started by this man, Feridun Adamiyat, whose father was actually a well-known name in the Persian Constitutional Revolution. Adamiyat's most famous book is Amir Kabir and Iran, which you see here, that's the cover of the book. On pages 243 to 244 of the first edition of this book, which was published in 1944, Adamiyat claimed that Mullah Hussein Boshuye, the Bab's first disciple, was actually an agent of the British government who was hired by this man, Arthur Connolly, an English intelligence officer who was also a researcher and writer. Supposedly, Connolly had asked Mullah Hussein to persuade the Bab to claim prophethood. Adamiyat claimed that the evidence for this accusation was in Connolly's book titled Journey Overland from England to Northern India via Russia, Persia, and Afghanistan, which mentions the meeting of Mullah Hussein and Connolly in 1830 during Connolly's journey to Khorasan. Well, the problem, obviously, was that in 1830, Mullah Hussein was 17 and the Bab was only 11. And that wasn't all. Connolly himself died at the young age of 35 in 1842. That was 2 years before the Bab even made his claim. So Baha'is couldn't defend themselves, but fortunately, there was a professor at the University of Tehran who knew Adamiyat, who also taught history at the University of Tehran, and he confronted him. He had a copy of Connolly's book in his hand and showed it to Adamiyat and said, show me where this book mentions Mullah Hussein and a meeting between him and Connolly. Adamiyat knew that his fabrication finally trapped him. So he accepted that he had done a forgery, and he promised to basically remove that forgery from the future volumes, which he did. But the problem is, think about this. An academician, how much hatred he should have towards Bábís and Bahá'ís, a well-known academician at the University of Tehran, he was willing to take that risk to discredit himself, and he did, at least in the side of that professor and the Bahá'ís, and now more and more people know about it. This is a picture of those pages, and the highlights that you see is where in the first edition of the book, he's talking about that supposed meeting that never happened between Connolly and Mullah Hussein. And of course, when Muslims discovered that the British government had conferred knighthood on Abdul Baha, that gave them the perfect excuse to push their accusation that the Baha'is were agents of the British, who were so happy with the services of Abdul Baha that they conferred knighthood on him. Again, what they didn't realize was that the British had conferred knighthood on Abdul Baha for the humanitarian services that he had rendered the people of Palestine region after widespread famine, which was the result of locust attacks, had threatened thousands of lives in the Akka, Haifa area. And most of those inhabitants back then were Muslims, ironically. Anybody can go to Wikipedia and do a search of the knighthoods of the British Empire, different kinds, and they'll find out that there is a category called humanitarian knighthood, and the very first person who ever received it was Abdul Baha, a Persian, in 1920, and specifically says why. Unfortunately, Iranian leftists, particularly some of the founders of the Communist Tudeh party in Iran, have also added fuel to the fire of these conspiracy theories. Typically, the leftists quote this man, Mikhail Sergeyevich Ivanov. He was a Marxist communist Iranologist and a former dean of the Faculty of Oriental Studies at St. Petersburg State University. Back then, it was called Leningrad. At the height of communism and Stalinistic thinking, he wrote a little book called Bábí Uprisings in Iran, 1848 to 1852. In this book, he glorifies the Bab as a revolutionary, but brands Baha'u'llah an agent of imperialism and foreign powers without providing a shred of evidence. That was good enough for the leftists in Iran. These two men that you see on the left, Ehsan Tabari and Nureddin Kianuri, were among the founders of the leftist Tudeh party. They were communists, and they basically propagated the same rubbish that the Russian author had before them. Now, one of the wonders of our time is that among Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, whom we discussed earlier, among his grandchildren, we find a communist in Nureddin Kianuri and a world-renowned Muslim scholar, Sayyid Hossein Nasr. He came from one of the daughters of Sheikh Fazlullah. Kianuri came from one of Sheikh Fazlullah's sons. This book actually takes the hate mongering to the very extreme and encourages genocide against the Baha'is. It was published in 1961 during the reign of the Shah, but it has been reprinted at least 21 times as of 10 years ago. That's the last number that I have. Now, it's written by this Ayatollah, this cleric, Sayyid Muhammad Mehdi Mortazavi Langrudi. This is the cover of the book. Baha'is are compared to insects. What you see here is an old-style insecticide can. The title says, in original Persian, it says, Imshi be hasharat Baha'i. In other words, exterminate the Baha'i insects. Now think about this. When other people started protesting, he said, no, I didn't mean that we should kill all of them. I meant just like you, if you see insects, you basically use insecticide to flee, to make sure that the insects flee away. I'm telling you, if Baha'is get close to you, just move away, go away. Now, you tell me, when you use insecticide, do you intend to kill or just say, hey, insect, just go away? Hardly anybody bought that argument, but unfortunately, that book is still available in Iran. Now, needless to say that things got a lot worse in 1979 when the Islamic government came to power. and their state-sponsored media have consistently and repeatedly engaged in demonizing Baha'is. What you're seeing here are just some examples of how they do that. They often try to feature their anti-Baha'i propaganda with scary or grotesque images next to the headline of the story, so their readers in their minds can associate the word Baha'i with those grotesque or scary images. Why? Because it's a psychological game. It makes dehumanizing and hating the Baha'is easier. This one at the bottom right is, believe it or not, from the page of an elementary school book that is mocking the Báb here at the center. So they are starting early. They want to make sure that the Muslim children are desensitized against future Baha'i persecutions from an early age. Absolutely shameful. And here are screenshots of the actual articles that use those images. In this one, on the bottom right, you see the ground is devouring the person who is praying towards the shrine of Baha'u'llah. In other words, they are saying, if you become a Baha'i, you're forced to turn to Akka in your prayer, and that ensures your eternal damnation and hellfire. And of course, their belief that hell is at the center of the earth. Again, scare tactics. Unfortunately, the end results of all these historical fabrications and baseless conspiracy theories have been a deep-seated mistrust and hatred towards the Baha'is in the hearts and minds of the masses of Iranians for multiple generations now. So when the Islamic regime came to power in 1979, within the first few years, when they killed well over 200 Baha'is, most Iranians remained silent. Why? Because they were already brainwashed by those lies and conspiracy theories. Of course, fortunately, in recent years, things have gradually begun to improve, and more non-Baha'is now, both inside Iran and outside, have been speaking up against the persecution of the Baha'is. And they are standing up for their human rights. So that's definitely a positive step, and Baha'is everywhere are very grateful for that. I think I have talked enough, so I'm going to stop now. And if there are any questions, I would be glad to try to answer them to the best of my ability. Forouz Jan, I want to make sure that you are not muted.
Thank you very much. Are you hearing me? Can you?
I'm hearing you, yes.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Masumian. This was really information that I wish we had that at the time of the revolution in Iran. It's a pity that we got this information late. But anyways, people, yeah, okay. Giti Jun, please go ahead.
Dr. Masumian, thank you so much. This was the most comprehensive lecture I've ever heard regarding the Mashrutiyat and the early history of the relationship between the Bábís, Azalis. My question is, we are here that the Iranian, the non-Baha'i Iranian under the age of 30, they are very different. The sociologists, psychologists tell us the way they are thinking is different. and this is a very good sign. What do you think that if someday this regime is no more, they are going to be more susceptible to listen, and because the Baha'is can express themselves, they respond to all these things that is going on. This is something that would happen.
Well, I can tell you my personal feeling is because of what has happened to the Iranian society over the past 44, 45 years, there is a great deal of mistrust towards people of faith, including not necessarily the Baha'is, including anybody who claims knowledge of religious authority. And so I think eventually the pendulum will swing back to the middle. But for a while, I think the Iranian population is so fed up with what they have seen during the past 45 years, a lot of them will be hesitant to investigate any religion, including the Baha'i faith. Now, again, that doesn't mean that there won't be sectors of population, especially among the youth, who will not do that. What I'm saying is there is a general pessimism right now among the masses of Iranians towards religion because of what has happened during the past 45 years. The good news is that the youth, the younger generation, are obviously very media savvy, and they are active on social media. And so we can reach out to them much easier than people of previous generations.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
Thank you, Giti Khanum. Mariam, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. This was a really interesting and eye-opening presentation, and I think that it's interesting because it's so clear that evildoers and genociders all have the same playbook. So there's so much similarity with, you know, the Nazis and, let's say, right now Putin's Russia. And the question I have is, and also, like, you know, the nationalist Serb rhetoric for the Bosnian Muslims. It's so much, there's so much similarity in evildoers who are evildoers in this way. And especially those who use propaganda, and they all use propaganda. My question is, do you see, and is there anybody who is compiling all of this? Because a lot of what you have is something that's not mainstream. Like, a lot of what you have and what you presented, and I'm sure you have far more, are things that, you know, if that you wouldn't be able to find if you didn't go looking for it, or if you didn't live in the Islamic Republic, so you had to be exposed to it in school or wherever. But is there a body or a person or somebody who's compiling all of this for future prosecution of these, I don't really want to call them people, but of these instigators? Is there a systematic compilation that is being compiled pursuant to laws, international laws that are in place, so that when it's time for the prosecution of these instigators to take place, all of the evidence is systematically and clearly already compiled?
Yes, actually, First of all, multiple books have also been written that document these, some of these, a lot of these. But the most comprehensive collection is, I don't know if you know about Dr. Payam Akhavan, who is a human rights attorney. He and a group of individuals have been actually documenting or gathering documents. I believe it is called Khane Asnad, if I'm not mistaken, the title. You can search for it on the web, the House of Documents. And I haven't delved too much into those documents, but I'm pretty sure that is exactly what they are trying to do, to provide a one-stop shop, if you will, a place where all of these documents can be accessible worldwide. I don't know how much of them have been translated into English yet, but I have a feeling that quite a few already have.
Great, thank you. I'm sure you have so much more information, and I would really be interested, and I'm sure everyone else here would also be so interested in a part 2 that that delves even deeper or is a continuation of what you've already presented today. Thank you very much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Siyy'íd, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Masumian. My question is about the quote from the Kitab Aqdas regarding the future of Tehran. I thought always that it has not happened yet. The just king and the things which are going to be happening to Tehran, to be the delight of the world and all that. I was thinking it is in the future, but I heard from you that it was addressing the Mashrute.
That portion of it where he's talking about, this is my opinion, that portion of it where he's talking about the just king, that there will appear a just king who, if it's God's will also observe the rights of the Bahá'ís and provide them with justice. That part is in the future. But, and it's farther down, actually. If you go to the quote, you'll see that part is farther down. But no, this part, I think, is what happened. And clearly, the Persian Constitutional Revolution indicated a change of power structure because you went from an absolutist monarchy system into a representative government, even though it was short-lived. And eventually we went back to what we have now. You still have had parliaments during the rest of the Qajar period, as well as the Pahlavi period, and now the Islamic regime, although the representatives of the Islamic regime, Majlis or parliament, are hardly representatives of the Iranian people.
Thank you.
Sure.
Giti Khanum, did you want to show the book of the Asadábádi Iran? Yeah, I think you're muted. Giti Khanum, you're muted.
I was just going to tell Mariam Khanum that this book is over 1,100 pages. It's by Turaj Amini, and it is from A to Z, all the documents you want to know about what happened to Iranian Baha'is. This is an amazing book. Unfortunately, it is in Farsi, but I am sure one day it would be English.
There are actually several volumes that Turaj has put together. This is one of them. He was working on one for after the revolution when he was arrested. Although he's free now and we are in touch, but yes, unfortunately, these have not been translated into English, but there are 3 volumes, I think, that are already published, and you showed one of them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mariam, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to take full advantage of the fact that my mom can't say no to me. So I will ask you another question. My question is, can you comment on the fact that so few groups and individuals in Iranian society stood up for the Bahá'ís, their fellow Iranian counterparts who were colleagues, friends, relatives, spouses, cousins, who were Bahá'ís, while they were being so brutally and savagely persecuted and genocided. You know, in Germany, they have a whole story of resistance. There were resistance groups. There were people who hid Jews. There's Yad Vashem in Israel, where there's a memorial to those people. I mean, I can attest to the fact that that we have these phenomenon everywhere where there has been genocide. And I think that in the Iranian case, it's lamentable that we have so few, not intellectuals even, individuals who were known to be quite open-minded when it came to any other kind of minority. But when it came to the Bahá'ís, there was this red line, and they didn't show up. And I think this is going to be like a really big red smear on the history of this country. But can you comment on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a number of factors. One of them was what I pointed out, that these conspiracy theories, these baseless fabrications, and the fact that Bahá'ís were not allowed to defend themselves against those fabrications for decades. They were gradually seeped into the psyche of the Iranians. And of course, people were too busy with their own lives. They didn't want to independently investigate the veracity of these claims. So they came to accept, if everybody is saying that they are Russian spies or agents of the British Empire, and I see Abdul Baha with a picture of the British flag right there and then, what else do I need? That closed basically the investigation for a lot of people. And there were also polemical works, or in Persian we say raddiye, things that essentially was written only to reject the validity of the Bab and Baha'u'llah and their claims. And so it was a combination of lack of education, lack of even desire to be educated about it. And also after the revolution, it was the fear that if they identify with Bahá'ís or even come to their defense, they would also be branded as enemies. And so, and they could even be labeled a Bahá'í. And by that, I mean, they would be endangering their families, they would be endangering their property. And they saw right and left what was happening to the Bahá'ís. You know, they would attack their homes, they would take their laptops, cell phones, whatever. And they wanted to protect themselves and their families. However, human rights activists have been an exception to that rule. As during the past 45 years or so, we have had people who continue to raise their hands and say, hey, foul game. This is not true. These are all fabrications. And as time goes by, more and more Iranians take the time to go to the internet and search for Baha'i or Baha'u'llah and see what they find for themselves. Let me tell you a quick story. Back in 1979, when my wife and I first moved to this country, we went to Washington, D.C. We both had admissions from George Washington University, the first family that we befriended was a fellow Iranian who was seeking his doctorate. I don't remember in what field, but he was also at GW, George Washington University. We invited him and his wife to a dinner at our home. And after the dinner, my wife started serving tea. And the man, seriously, he wasn't joking. He was saying, oh, so is this the famous Persian tea? The Baha'i tea? For those of you who don't know, there is this, I don't know what to call it, myth among Iranians that Baha'is have a special tea, that if you drink, you get converted to the Baha'i faith. And it originates actually from the time of Baha'u'llah, when he becomes a Bábí, goes back to Mazandaran in the Noor area, and he started teaching the Báb's faith there. And so a lot of people would come to his residence there, and they would be served tea, and a lot of them would leave as Baha'is. So the clerics in the area started that rumor that, hey, if you go to the home of Mirza Hossein Ali Noori Baha'u'llah, don't drink that tea. Here in America, I had a fellow student in the doctoral program who had believed in that and said, oh, is that the special tea? I didn't know if I should laugh or cry. And that's what happens when you don't take the time to investigate the truth for yourself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masumian. Dr. Siyy'íd?
Yes, I was just going to say, of course, we are going to keep all these documents, but we are not seeking revenge, but we are hoping for the change of heart in our countrymen.
Yes, that's the most important thing. We cannot change the past. We can learn from it and move forward.
This was such a wonderful presentation. There is so much different remarks that are in the chat. Dr. Masumian, you have to promise us that you will be back. I don't know if you hear me or not. If you don't hear me, I can call you and tell you that we would like to have you back, Dr. Masumian. At least shake your head so I know you're hearing me.
I can hear you, Forouz Jan. I can hear you. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. I'm so grateful, and I'm very happy that this particular program in its totality will be uploaded on YouTube, so the friends can, because tonight was the feast night, so many people asked me if everything could be recorded, and we did record that. With your permission, Dr. Masumian, after really offering you our absolute gratitude and appreciation for coming and joining us and sharing this information, would you permit us to start our devotionals? Well, Jale Khanim Wafai would like to ask a question, and after that, we will have time for at least 2-3 prayers. Jale Khanim, بفرمایید.
سلام با حضور کلی عزیزان، شما خانم فروز فراموش.
Jale Khanim, you're not speaking in English. No, you want me to translate?
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Aloha to everyone. I want to say my appreciation for Dr. Masumian. It was wonderful. I enjoyed it and I learned a lot. And thank you so much to you, Forouz Khanum. Would you please, I want to ask if it's possible, I have the record of this session that today.
Yes, Jale Khanum, this will be uploaded on YouTube and the link is the Bahá'ís of Oakville. If you would like to leave me in chat your email address, I will send it to you.
Sure, thank you so much.
You're-
I can see it in YouTube.
You leave me your email address on chat, and
Okay, I do.
thank you so much. Also, I just wanted to read for you, Dr. Masumian, Mr. Abrol from India. He says Baha'i tea too was not trusted even in the Iranian community in Bombay in 1900s.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised.
Yes, yes, yes. Friends, the link is Bahá'ís of Oakville, and I will put it in chat in a second, but I'm wondering if Simi Khanum Pina and Mr. Liu, and I'm wondering if we have more people here who would like to say, yeah, Jane, you'd like to say prayers. Can you raise your hands? So Pina Jan, you'll be number one, and then we will continue. Dr. Masumian, Pina is a Baha'i from the Philippines who lives in Malaysia, and she speaks Farsi fluently, and but I would like to ask, if possible, Pinajan, if you can start with a Malay prayer, if possible. Mr. Abrol, can you raise your hand? We would love to have a prayer either in Hindi or even English. I would appreciate it. Thank you, thank you. Mr. Liu, please. Raise your hand too, Mr. Liu. Dr. Masumian, do you have 10 more minutes to be with us for the prayers?
Of course, yes.
Thank you. So, Pinajan, why don't you start, please? You are muted. Pina, you're
Ya Tuhan, bersatukanlah hati hamba, perlihatkanlah kepada mereka itu maksudmu yang agung, maksudmu yang agung. Ya Tuhan, bersatukanlah hati hambamu. Oh my God, unite the hearts of thy servants and reveal to them thy great purpose. May they follow thy commandments and abide in thy law. Ya Tuhan, bersatukanlah hati hamba. Adakah penghalang kesukaran selain Tuhan? Katakanlah terpujilah Tuhan. semua tunduk pada perintahnya. Adakah penghalau kesukaran selain Tuhan? Katakanlah terpujilah Tuhan. Ya Tuhan, semua hamba-Nya dan semua tunduk pada perintahnya.
الله ابها ای متوجه الله، چشم از جمیع ما سبای بربند و به ملکوت ابها برگشای. آنچه خواهی از او خواه و آنچه طلبی از او طلب. به نظری 100,000 حاجاتت روا نماید و به التفاتی 100,000 درد بی درمان دوا کند. به انعطافی زخم را مرهم نهد و به نگاهی دلها را از قید غم برهاند. آنچه کند او کند، ما چه توانی کرد؟ یفعل ما یشاء و یحکم ما یرید. پس سر تسلیم نه و توکل بر رب رحیم به و البهان علیک. ای
अपने 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 हृदय को पवित्र कर लो ताकि तुम मेरा स्मरण कर सको। अपने कानों को शुद्ध कर लो ताकि तुम मेरे शब्दों को सुन सको। तब तुम अपना ध्यान उस पवित्र स्थल की ओर लगाओ जहाँ सर्वदयालु तुम्हारे स्वामी का सिंहासन स्थापित किया गया है और कहो, हे मेरे स्वामी, तेरी जय हो, तेरी जय हो, तेरी जय हो। ओ अल्लाह।
Go ahead, Mr. Hissam. Dr. Hissam, please go ahead.
ولبها جمال لبها حسرت کبریا این سرگشتگان گمگشتگان کوی تو هم و سودایان روی تو عنایتی فرما تا حلول جلوگاه روی تو گردد و صدور آتشکده های پاسوز انوار اسرار و سرائر بتابد و پرتو بینش بر بساط زنم این
Dear friends, thank you so much. Today's program was so beautiful. I forgot to stop recording, so I'm going to stop the recording right now. And